Igor Stravinsky composed Le Sacre du Printemps, Rite of Spring, in 1912 as a pantomime ballet. It was first performed a year later by Sergei Diaghilev's Ballet Russe in Paris, with choreography that attempted to suggest tribal dances and rituals in prehistoric Russia. Stravinsky himself, however, never considered this the only possible interpretation of the work. The pretext of the prehistoric birth of spring suggested to me the construction of the work, he wrote, but added, "The rite exists as a piece of music, first and last." Walt Disney visualized Rite of Spring as a story of the evolution of life on Earth during the first billions of years of this planet's existence. His scenario is divided into 8 sections. Trip through space. We are to imagine ourselves out in space, looking down from light years away on the planet Earth before there was any life on it. The camera takes us into a spiral nebula, past the sun, past a black nebula, comets, a red nebula, and a meteor, moving always towards the Earth, until it arrives amid spouting and exploding craters. Volcanoes. Craters erupt. Hot lava flows. Rivers of lava reach the sea. The Earth cools. Undersea life and growth. One-celled creatures appear, then hydras, annelid worms, jellyfish, trilobites. The first fish appear, then lungfish, capable of remaining alive with their heads out of water, then true amphibians. The fins of Polypterus change to legs, and he walks up a submerged rock to the surface of the ocean. Pterodactyls, the flying reptiles of the Jurassic period, which ended 136 million years ago, dive and glide again. A mosasaur rises from a lagoon and pulls a pterodactyl down underwater. Family life. The age of the dinosaurs. Feeding and child-rearing habits of Dimetrodon, Stegosaurus, Brontosaurus, Triceratops, and others. Fight! Survival of the fittest. Stegosaurus was more than twice as big as an elephant and wore a heavy coat of scales, almost like a suit of armor. There were 4 huge spikes at the tip of his powerful tail. He is attacked by Tyrannosaurus Rex, king of the tyrant lizards, a dinosaur standing 18 feet high and measuring about 47 feet overall. With his enormous jaws, lined with saber-sharp teeth 6 inches long, he brings Stegosaurus down and breaks his neck. Volcanoes rumble, warning of changes that will take place on Earth. Trek. Dinosaurs pant their way to extinction through the terrible heat that is drying up water and green plants. This is a visualization of the late Cretaceous extinction some 70 million years ago, which set the stage for the era of mammals and the eventual evolution of man. Earthquake. Earthquakes open huge crevices. Subterranean volcanoes burst to the surface of the oceans, creating giant tidal waves that engulf so many surviving creatures on land that the sea is once again the custodian of most of the life on Earth. Walt Disney's immediate and spontaneous reaction the first time he heard Igor Stravinsky's Le Sacre du Printemps is recorded in the minutes of the story meeting that took place on September 13, 1938. "This is marvelous," said Disney. "It would be perfect for prehistoric animals." Up to that moment, Disney and his associates had been considering Stravinsky's Firebird for inclusion in the concert feature. But Walt had then asked, was there ever anything written on which we might build something on a prehistoric theme with prehistoric animals? The Sacre du Printemps would be something on that order, Deems Taylor suggested, and a recording of Stravinsky's 1913 ballet music was played. There would be something terrific in dinosaurs, flying lizards, and prehistoric monsters, said Walt. There could be beauty in the settings. A dawn of creation theme, added Joe Grant, head of Disney's character model department, and with Dick Humer, story director of Fantasia. As Walt showed more and more enthusiasm about a prehistoric sequence set to the Rite of Spring ballet music, whose original choreography concerned the ritual sacrifice of a maiden, Stokowski said, perhaps we could in some way retain the idea of a sacrifice. The jungle is full of sacrifice, animals preying upon each other and being preyed upon. That is life. If we could put that on the screen and end with the most terrific and terrifying of the animals fighting and eating each other, people would gasp. Disney responded enthusiastically to this suggestion. We could base it on the dog-eat-dog idea all the way through. We could have a battle and build it to a grand climax. It is the fight for life.
And so, we are all connected in the great circle of life.
So Walt Disney chose Rite of Spring for Fantasia, based on a suggestion by Deems Taylor, not Stokowski. Stravinsky's widow, Vera, and Robert Kraft, Stravinsky's friend and associate, were mistaken when they wrote in Stravinsky in Pictures and Documents that the Sacre was undoubtedly Stokowski's, not Disney's choice, an assumption probably based upon the fact that, as early as 1927, Stokowski had written to Stravinsky telling him that he wished to study the score and, if Stravinsky was willing, to record it. In actual fact, the choice of all the music in Fantasia was Disney's. At the Walt Disney Studio, the final decision on all matters rested with Walt Disney. He was absolute monarch there, said Humer. Why not? He made it. It is certainly true, however, that Leopold Stokowski was an early champion of Stravinsky's most controversial score. Indeed, it was Stokowski who, in 1930, gave Rite of Spring its first American performance, with Martha Graham dancing the role of the sacrificial victim in Leonid Messiaen's choreography. The famous premiere of Sacre in Paris in 1913 was perhaps the greatest scandal in the history of 20th century music, for, as Jean Cocteau described the scene, people talked, booed, whistled, imitated animal cries. Perhaps they would have grown tired eventually if a group of aesthetics and some musicians had not been carried away by an excessive zeal and insulted, even jostled the audience in the logs. The uproar degenerated into a pitched battle. Standing in her box, her diadem askew, the elderly Comtesse de Portal brandished her fan and, in a positive frenzy, cried,
"This is the first time in 60 years that anyone has dared make fun of me."
The good lady was sincere. She really believed it was all a practical joke.
And so we were introduced to this historic work in the midst of such tumult that the dancers could no longer hear the orchestra and had to take the beat from Nijinsky, who was prancing and yelling in the wings.
In 1938, 25 years after this tumultuous premiere, Stokowski acquainted Disney with the ballet's history. "This music has never been done justice to," he said. "It is too powerful. There was a terrific storm of protest when it was new. Critics sneer at it now, but you can't push it aside. We would cut it to about 18 or 19 minutes. But in fact, Disney used it at 30 minutes, though the sequence of the movements was altered to fit the continuity of the visual accompaniment. Since Walt Disney, the movie producer with no formal training in music, responded enthusiastically to Rite of Spring the first time he heard it, it is amusing to read what Deems Taylor, the composer and critic, wrote about the work in 1920. I'm not competent to discuss Le Sacre du Printemps, as I have heard it only on the piano. But assuming that Stravinsky is mechanism become music, I don't want it. I'm bored with imitations of noises and their monotonous cacophony. Of course it sounds like cacophony because I'm not used to it. By 1938, Taylor had gotten used to it enough to suggest it to Disney as a piece, on which we might build something on a prehistoric theme. And this is the way that Taylor justified the music's new scenario when he introduced the piece in Fantasia.
When Igor Stravinsky wrote his ballet, The Rite of Spring, his purpose was, in his own words, to express primitive life. And so Walt Disney and his fellow artists have taken him at his word. Instead of presenting the ballet in its original form as a simple series of tribal dances, they have visualized it as a pageant, as the story of the growth of life on Earth. And that story, as you're going to see it, isn't the product of anybody's imagination. It's a coldly accurate reproduction of what science thinks went on during the first few billion years of this planet's existence.
Earlier, in that same September 13, 1938 story meeting, when Disney listened to Shostakovich's Age of Steel and considered making a montage effect of a building being erected or something to that music, Walt had asked Stokowski, "Should we stick as closely as possible to the original ideas behind the music?" And Stokowski had replied, "Composers are not a bit strict about those things. They write for a certain idea, but when you suggest something else, they are likely to agree. We shouldn't worry if the spirit of the music is with us." The subsequent history of the relationship between Walt Disney and Igor Stravinsky is a fascinating account of a composer who first wasn't, and then was, strict about those things. By the end of the meeting at which Rite of Spring was first played, Disney, Stokowski, and Taylor were all in agreement that making a visual accompaniment to Stravinsky's music was an important thing to do. "I think you can bring this music to the consciousness of people so they will see how great it really is," said Stokowski. "At present, they are trying to down it. The men who are not creators sneer at it." And Taylor added, "The great handicap that it has labored under is that it is not absolute music. It was written for motion and sight, and when it is played in the concert hall, you only hear half of it. The motion is right in the music." Joe Grant had warned that no matter how well we do prehistoric animals in our medium, people will laugh at them. They're just built for laughs. It is a theme that requires humor. Grant was no doubt recalling that one of the earliest animated films, Winsor McKay's 1909 Gertie the Dinosaur, had portrayed prehistoric creatures strictly for laughs, and in all the years since, dinosaurs had appeared in cartoons only as comical characters. Considering Disney's personality, that was probably an additional reason for him to take the new road. So Walt put the question to Stokowski, "Should we take this dramatic theme?" "That would be the idea behind it," said Stokowski. And that was the idea behind it. The Disney studio was already in communication with Stravinsky. On April 12, 1938, when Fantasia's music was still being selected, a Disney agent had asked Stravinsky's publisher for permission to use the Firebird in the concert feature. Nothing came of this inspiration, but when Disney requested the film rights to Rite of Spring, Stravinsky instructed his New York attorney to sign a contract with Walt Disney Productions for the irrevocable right, license, privilege, and authority to record in any manner, medium, or form Rites of Spring for use in the film Fantasia. The contract was signed January 4th, 1939. The sum paid, according to Kraft and Mrs. Stravinsky, was $6,000. Just before Christmas that year, Stravinsky visited the Disney studio in the company of the choreographer George Balanchine. He was shown The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which he told Disney he liked, and storyboards and models for Rite of Spring, which was then being animated. He posed for many pictures with Disney and his artists, and even took time out to joke with one of the animators working to the music. "We were having our Christmas party," remembered Wolfgang Reitherman. "I was animating the dinosaurs at the time, and after a few drinks, I went into my room and started running the soundtrack to Rite of Spring backward." You didn't hear any melody, but you sure heard some pretty dynamic sounds. I was enjoying it. Suddenly, the door opened, and there was Walt with Igor Stravinsky. Stravinsky was very nice about it. He said, "Sounds good backward, too." According to Kraft and the composer's widow, Stravinsky was shown the finished film of Rite of Spring on October 12, 1940. They say that 11 days after this preview, on October 23rd, two Disney directors called on the composer to discuss the possibility of making an animated film of Renard, Stravinsky's comic score about a fox in the barnyard. On October 28th, Stravinsky sold an option to Disney not only for Renard, but also for Fireworks and the Firebird. In later years, Stravinsky was quoted as being critical of the Disney version of the Rite of Spring. The Champaign-Urbana Courier, in an interview with Stravinsky published March 3, 1949, reported that Stravinsky spoke of Walt Disney's treatment of his music in Fantasia as terrible. "I saw a part of it at the studio and walked out." Kraft and Vera Stravinsky explained the fact that the composer subsequently signed more contracts to have his music used in more Disney films by saying that he sold the option, probably realizing that the music would never be used. It is difficult to see how Stravinsky could have thought, when he sold Disney the option 17 days before Fantasia was premiered, to use 3 more of his compositions in film, that the music would not be used. At that time, Disney was so confident that Fantasia was going to be a financial success on its first release that work was already going forward on a second Fantasia, which was to include a Disney version of Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf. Disney's daughter, Diane Disney Miller, remembers being told that when Prokofiev visited the United States, he'd come to see Father with an unpublished score of Peter and the Wolf, and he said, "I've composed this with the hope that someday you'll make a cartoon using my music." Disney and Stokowski had already begun planning Peter and the Wolf in story meetings for the second Fantasia, and when the project was abandoned because the original film failed to earn back its investment on its first release, Disney still completed Peter and the Wolf and released it as part of a 1946 film called Make Mine Music, composed mainly of pop music. In that same year, Stravinsky expressed his philosophy toward what Stokowski called music for all of us in an article in Musical Digest. When Walt Disney used Le Sacre du Printemps for Fantasia, he told me, "Think of the numbers of people who will now be able to hear your music." Well, the numbers of people who consume music is of interest to somebody like Mr. Sol Hurak, the concert impresario, but it is of no interest to me. The mass adds nothing to art. It cannot raise the level, and the artist who aims consciously at mass appeal can do so only by lowering his own level. The soul of each individual who listens to my music is important to me, not the mass feeling of a group. Music cannot be helped by means of an increase of the quality of listeners, be this increase affected by the film or any other medium. It can be helped only through an increase in the quality of listening, the quality of the individual soul. One man's individual soul was saddened when reading that. He thought of growing up in rural Illinois during World War II and of being introduced to Stravinsky's music by Fantasia, then saving up to buy a record of Stravinsky himself conducting Rite of Spring, then going on to buy Petrushka and Firebird, and of how, as a grown man, he finally saw Stravinsky conduct his own works and was part of the standing ovation given the 84-year-old composer after his farewell concert in Chicago. And this man thought of how another Disney cartoon, called The Whale Who Wanted to Sing at the Met, started him listening to the Metropolitan Opera radio broadcasts on Saturday afternoons. Stravinsky, whose father was the leading basso at the Imperial Opera House in St. Petersburg, who had 2 grand pianos in the family drawing room, perhaps had no need for Fantasia. He was in a position to insist that music cannot be helped by means of an increase of the quality of listeners, but the quality of listening in Winnebago County, Illinois, depending on having good music of quality to listen to, even in the small towns of America. For a generation after World War II, it was no longer fashionable among intellectuals to appreciate Disney. But the mood when Stravinsky signed his second contract with Disney was very different. We see it in the Time magazine cover story on Fantasia in November 1940, written before it became apparent that the mass audience was not yet ready after all to accept Fantasia. An imposing list of top-flight contemporary composers, Paul Hindemith, Sergei Prokofiev, William Grant Still, Deems Taylor, and so on, have vowed that they would spend their lives working for Disney if he would give them the chance. Composer Igor Stravinsky himself had signed a contract to do more music with Disney, has blandly averred that Disney's paleontological cataclysm was what he had in mind all along in his Rite of Spring. From the onset, Rite of Spring was conceived as a scientific document, said John Hubley, who is the art director of 3 of the segment's 8 sections, Trip Through Space, Volcanoes, and Earthquake. Walt explained what he wanted in 15 simple words, as though the studio had sent an expedition back to the Earth 6 million years ago. To create the illusion of a trip through space in those days before the space age, Disney's special effects department did some of its most imaginative work. First of all, animating 1,000 stars in their courses would create an effect that would not be equal to the time it would take. Therefore, a model of the Earth was made from a 30-watt Mazda light globe about 18 inches in diameter, painted red. It revolved and was illuminated in such a way as to show its craters to best advantage. This Earth was suspended at the end of a darkened room about 20 feet long. In this room, the effects animators had created a little universe of stars. First they hung shining beads of various sizes at the ends of threads at various lengths. At the end of the room, behind the Earth, was a dark screen. This screen was punctured with innumerable small holes and illuminated from behind. When a 35mm movie camera trucked through the bead stars toward the light globe Earth, the pinholes of light gave the illusion of an infinity of stars twinkling beyond our planet. This million-mile truck through space was the answer of Disney's artists of Walt's vision 2 years before, when he thought about the opening of Rite of Spring and said, "Boy, you'll really go through space. I think it would be a terrific idea. That idea of endless space." Since so many of the visuals in Rite of Spring were aimed at reproducing the appearance of things never seen, or not seen in such a form, careful studies were made of existing archaeological reconstructions and prehistoric lore. So intense became this paleontological hunger, wrote Hubley, that contact with museums and PhDs was established. Here's a characteristic Rite of Spring request. Please provide anything and everything pertaining to the Permian Age through the Triassic, which covers development from amphibians to earliest reptile forms. Note, Grantops, Schimognathus, Seymoria, Cyanognanthus, and relating forms. The studio later said that such world-famous authorities as Roy Chapman Andrews, Julian Huxley, Barnum Brown, and Edwin P. Hubble volunteered helpful data and became enthusiastic followers of the picture's progress. One of the problems, for example, was how to picture the primeval convulsions of the Earth's surface. Josh Metter, who supervised the animation of the special effects, found a way to show mud pots bubbling and breaking and splashing that resulted in convincing movement on the screen. First, he mixed a gummy mess of oatmeal, mud, and coffee in a vat. Then he sent bubbles up through it with air hoses. High-speed cameras photographed this action. The individual frames were processed on cells dyed red against a yellow background. Animation was added to create more splashes and broaden the action. All this was photographed against backgrounds with controlled light intensities. At the beginning, the animators had trouble visualizing the scale of the dinosaurs. Bill Roberts, co-director of Rite of Spring with Paul Satterfield, peered over his wire-rimmed eyeglasses and offered them this advice. Just draw a 12-story building in perspective, then convert it into a dinosaur and animate it. How well the dinosaurs turned out can be proved by the fact that nationally known scientists, seeing Fantasia, have concurred that prehistoric life becomes an exciting reality through Disney's unique medium. The New York Academy of Science asked for a private showing of Rite of Spring, reported Time, because they thought its dinosaurs better science than whole museum loads of fossils and taxidermy. Roberts decided that the most effective way of suggesting the immensity of a beast that measured 47 feet long and 18 feet high would be to have the audience gaze up at it from below. So the camera level was kept low, which was particularly effective in the battle at the end. Stokowski had told Disney that, "If we could end with the most terrific and terrifying of the animals fighting and eating each other, people would gasp." Discussing such a battle at an early story meeting, one storyman suggested using the Triceratops. "No," broke in another, who obviously knew his dinosaurs. "We want to use the Stegosaurus because of this action of his tail with the 4 spikes." So it became a battle between Stegosaurus and the most terrific and terrifying of all dinosaurs, Tyrannosaurus Rex. No human being, of course, had ever seen the action of a Stegosaurus's tail. While scientists have been able to reconstruct the skeletons of the dinosaur so that we have an accurate picture of their size and shape and weight, it was not until the Disney artists combined their study and the skeletal remains with their animators' knowledge of balance and weight that anyone had an educated visualization of how these creatures might have moved. "When we first started on the Rite of Spring," said art director Dick Kelsey, "it was the general consensus that it was to be very dark and moody. But it appeared that as it progressed, and they began to evaluate the animation more highly, they gradually eliminated the mood and replaced it with clarity of action. Goethe once said, "All that is alive tends toward color, individuality, specificity, effectiveness, and opacity. All that is done with life inclines toward knowledge, abstraction, generality, transfiguration, and transparency." The Disney artists gradually visualized specific dinosaurs who were individuals of a certain effective shape. Diplodocus had a long neck. He could eat his dinner from the treetops. An opaque color, Tyrannosaurus Rex, the tyrant king of the dinosaurs, is a black shape with blood-red eyes and mouth. When the animators took the next step and visualized these creatures in motion, they transformed prehistoric monsters from creatures who had long been done with life to creatures who are once again alive. The scheme of this segment is a good example of the proper use of animation to show things that are beyond the capabilities of live-action film. It imaginatively pictures the process of evolution from the time when this planet was still a molten mass to the point where the dinosaurs disappeared from the face of the earth. Père Laurence, a major figure in the development of the documentary film The Plow That Broke the Plains and the River, saw the importance of Rite of Spring as a document of that which could not otherwise be documented, calling it the most extraordinary motion picture I've ever seen on the screen. It is by far the most daring, powerful, exciting, and successful portion of Fantasia. But it took a generation for it to become clear what the impact of Fantasia's Rite of Spring had been. Disney had originally intended to carry his screen story beyond the death of the dinosaurs, through the age of mammals and the first men, to fire and the triumph of man. But the fundamentalists, according to John Hubley, threatened to make trouble for Fantasia if Walt connected evolution with human beings. Disney thereupon decided that Fantasia might have enough trouble getting accepted by the general public, as indeed it did, without courting a creationist boycott. Ideas similar to those contained in the Disney Studios' 1938 outline of Part 3, Fire and the Triumph of Man, finally reached the screen over 40 years later in the 1981 film Quest for Fire without causing problems. The death of the dinosaurs, however, was brought to the screen most memorably by Fantasia. No problem in paleontology has attracted more attention or led to more frustration than the search for causes of these extinctions, wrote the Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould. Nor has the problem escaped public notice. I remember well my first exposure to it at age 5, the dinosaurs of Disney's Fantasia panting to their deaths across a desiccating landscape to the tune of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. What better testimony to the educational value of Fantasia's prehistoric segment could there be than the recollection of one of science's leading paleontologists that his earliest inspiration was Rite of Spring? What tribute to Rite of Spring could be more touching than the dedication of Professor Gould's book, Ever Since Darwin, Reflections in Natural History? Quote, "For my father, who took me to see the Tyrannosaurus when I was 5. Unquote. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we will have a brief intermission